Hi, welcome back to Bethenaeum. My name's Ellie Marie, and today we are going to talk about 7 characters that you should probably think about putting in your novel. So, today we are doing our second part of Character Creation Week, and that means that we are finishing up with characters, and next week we'll be moving on to plot. So today we're going to talk about some different types of characters that you will probably want to try to fit into your work, or that you probably already have. A lot of these are going to be very natural characters for people to automatically put into their works, so you probably already have a few. Some of them might be new ideas, and that's also good because it'll give you some food for thought while you are developing your novel. First, we're going to actually look at a couple of the differences in the basic character models, such as major versus minor characters and protagonist versus antagonist. And I'm going to cover those basic definitions. I'm assuming a lot of you already know what those are, but these videos are meant to be for beginners, and so I don't ever want to skip anything because I feel like I'm going to have an audience here that may or may not know the definitions of those words. So we're going to go over those really quick for you. First, let's take a look at major characters versus minor characters. That seems like it should be pretty obvious, but I still want to touch on it just to make sure we're all on the same page. Major characters are going to be those characters that play big roles in your plot. So your main character, your main character's friend, or your villain, or your villain's friend that may have a bigger hand in things than like the henchman kind of characters. You might also have a love interest character, and that might also be a major character in your work. Minor characters are going to be those ones that are needed to help move the plot forward or move the major characters forward in their motion and in their action, but they themselves do not have huge bearings on the plot. They are important and they are needed. Minor characters are needed. Don't ever feel like minor means that they're not needed and you can pull them out. Your story has to have minor characters in order for the plot to progress, but they are going to be less important to the plot than the major characters. So you have major characters, which the plot centers around and is about, and minor characters, which the plot needs to be pushed forward through what is happening. Because without some of these minor characters, our major characters either wouldn't or couldn't do what they need to do to progress through the plot. Next, let's look at protagonist versus antagonist. Protagonist is your primary good guy. Now, just because I use the term good guy doesn't mean they have to really be good. It's just in a standard story arc, in a standard story, you follow the character that your audience is meant to sympathize with, which makes them somewhat of the good guy. Even if your novel is about a villain or about a bad guy, you are meant to have your readers feel some sort of sympathy for these characters and to connect with them in some way, and that makes them kind of a good guy, even if they're a quote-unquote anti-hero. And we will touch briefly on an anti-hero a little bit later. So that is your protagonist. Your antagonist is going to be whatever pushes against your protagonist, pushes them to keep them from achieving their goal, whatever their goal is for your story. So traditionally an antagonist would be another character. It would be like a villain or a unknowing bad guy. So someone who has really good intentions but is keeping our protagonist, the person that we are sympathizing with and connected with, from achieving their goals. Now, if you are a little bit more advanced writer, or if you're a little more advanced plotter, you know that your antagonist does not necessarily have to be a character. It can be a situation, it can be outside forces, it can be other things. But traditionally, it is another character. And even if you have an antagonist type thing that is not a character, it is common still to have a face character that represents that force that is keeping your protagonist from achieving their goal. So really quick, before we get into the 7 characters that you should consider having in your novel, let's look really quick at some abnormal definitions of protagonist and antagonist. So One of the more abnormal protagonists is called an antihero. And these are going to be heroes that aren't our standard definition of a hero. One of my favorite examples of an antihero is Spike from Buffy. And I used that in my live video this week, not just because one of my people who gets on for my live videos loves Buffy like I do, but because he just really is a good definition of an antihero. We follow him for a bit, we connect with him. He even, along the storylines in Buffy, becomes connected with the central protagonist, but he's still just not that, knight in shining armor good guy. He still makes bad choices knowingly. He still knowingly chooses the unmoral way out. And he does these things, but he still has that little bit of good in him that allows people to connect with him. He's still relatable, and he is still a protagonist in that sense. On the other side, you have antagonists who are not always necessarily villains. You can have an antagonist who really genuinely thinks that they are doing the right thing. You can have a man who is stealing bread from a store regularly, causing the protagonist, who's the owner of the store, to be unable to meet his goals of having zero shrink. If you work in retail, shrink means missing product or product that is unaccounted for. So while the antagonist is doing a good thing, he's stealing bread to feed his family because they are poor and can't afford food, he is still the antagonist because our protagonist is the owner of the shop and his goal is to have a zero shrink rate. I don't know why I chose that as my example, but I did, and it's a little late to go back now. But it is a basic example, and it gives you an understanding of a little bit of what an anti-hero is, like Spike, and then you have a little bit of this antagonist who's not necessarily the traditional villain, but they still stand in the way of the protagonist reaching his goal. And so that will kind of give you a little bit more playroom, a little bit more flex in your characters, and a little bit more of understanding that characters need to have their good and bad sides, just like human beings. They need to be, in order to be deep, well-rounded characters, you need to be able to have at least a little bit of sympathy for each character, including your bad guys or your villains, your antagonists. All right, so let's take a look at these 7 characters that you should consider having in your novel. The first one is the Confidant. Now, this character can be paired with either the protagonist or the antagonist. And generally, they are going to be like a sidekick or a best friend character that the antagonist or the protagonist connects with very well. And so they share things with them that they wouldn't share with other people. A good example of this is going to be Frodo and Sam from Lord of the Rings. It's a primary example because everybody knows what I'm talking about. Because even if you haven't read the books, you've seen the movie, most likely. I do have some friends who haven't, but they would still understand what I'm talking about. So Samwise is a perfect example of a confidant because he's someone that Frodo shares a lot of stuff with in the story that he doesn't really share with other characters, and that even after their adventures, they still have this connection and understanding between the two of them that the other characters don't have with them because of what they went through. And so that is a confidant. Oftentimes a confidant also acts as a way for the reader to experience the internal monologue of a primary character without the awkwardness of just being like, Frodo thought blah, 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 because you're reading in third person and the narrator really, in all honesty, shouldn't know what's going on inside a primary character's head. And so in order to share that with the reader, you have a confidant character that the primary character shares with so that the reader can get that little bit of an inside glimpse into the primary character's thoughts and reasoning. The second character that you should consider putting in your story is a developing character. Chances are you already have these without even realizing it. A lot of times people put these in without thinking about it because they're just natural characters to put in. These are going to be characters that push your primary characters into their development or that press the plot forward, whether or not they are primary characters themselves. So remember we talked a little bit about those minor characters? That's what developing characters are. Another kind of developing character is a character that has their own personal story arc throughout the story that is separate from the primary story arc. And we'll get into that a little bit more next week when we talk about story arcs. But there are going to be several little tiny story arcs inside of your big story arc. Hopefully, that is the goal, unless you're writing a very, very simplistic story. And so developing characters can also be characters that go through their own change and their own small arc. And they have things that develop within themselves that you see, even if the primary characters don't necessarily have that arc. In a good novel, a primary character will have an arc, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes the arc happens in other characters around, and those are also considered developing characters. The third character that you should consider having in your novel is called a foil character. Now, this one is one that fewer people have heard of. A foil character is basically the opposite. That's what it stands for. So it could be the opposite of your protagonist or the opposite of your antagonist. It just depends on where you would like to place your foil character. And basically what that means is if your protagonist, your hero character, is that very classic bravado, confident, I can do anything hero, then maybe your foil character is quiet and shy and timid and unsure of themselves, and they're their best friend that kind of comes along because that character who is very outgoing just needs a little help, or because they can't imagine life without that hero character, and so they kind of tag along. Now, this is a good time to also mention that these 7 characters don't have to be 7 separate characters. They can be 7 similar characters, so characters that are all kind of blended together. So you could have a foil character that is also a confidant. You could have a foil character that's also a developing character. You could have a character that's all 3 of these first ones that we've talked about. And you could have a character that is all 3 of these and the 4th thing that we're going to talk about. So the 4th character that you should consider having in your novel is the love interest. Now, the love interest character doesn't mean that your novel needs to be a romance. It just is kind of something that can be on the sidelines. It can be something that's hinted at, so that if maybe you decide to create your novel into a series, you have that built in. And like I said before, your love interest doesn't have to be there strictly as a love interest. They can be there because they are the primary character's confidant character. And they can be there because they are a foil character. They don't have to necessarily initially be a love interest. It could be that that develops later on down the road, or that, and actually it's better that way, because that way you don't have this flat character who is following your protagonist around and only has the purpose of being the love interest. They have other reasons for being there, and that's important too, to give your love interest characters more depth than simply being there for romance. The 5th character that you should consider having in your novel is the mentor character. Just like developing characters, chances are you already have a mentor character of some kind. Mentor characters are incredibly common to help protagonists push themselves over that bump and get themselves over whatever it is that is pushing back against them to keep them from accomplishing their goal. So a good mentor example is going to be Yoda or Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars. You have Luke. He gains a little bit of mentorship from Obi-Wan Kenobi. In fact, a lot of people consider him to be his primary mentor, because he even points him towards Yoda, who is another mentor in that series. So you have these characters that maybe aren't necessarily primary characters for the entire series, but they are important characters, and they are the characters that teach your protagonist something either about themselves, about the world around them, or about your antagonist and in how they can overcome them. The 6th character you should consider having in your novel is the narrator. Now, a lot of people don't think about having a specific narrator in their story, especially if you're writing in 3rd person. But truth is, even if you're writing in 3rd person, you can give your narrator a little bit of personality. Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events is sort of like this. The narrator kind of has their own little bit of personality, and you can tell when they are telling the story that it's not just meant to be the reader gathering this information so that they can travel through the story. The narrator has their own personality, and it kind of comes out in the way that they talk about things. And it's fun, and it gives your novel a little bit of depth if you're looking for something that kind of has that feel to it. The seventh and final character that you should consider having in your novel are flat characters. Flat characters are important. I know in my creating characters, I talked a lot about not wanting to have flat characters, but you don't want to have flat characters where your character shouldn't be flat. If you have flat characters where you should have deep characters, then your plot will fall flat and it won't work. But you need to have flat characters. You need to have that unnamed merchant that sells your hero something that ends up being important down the road. You need to have that unnamed guard that is supposed to be guarding your hero and keeping them from escaping but fails at his job. You can't have every character in your story be a completely fully developed character with their own life and their own story arc, because then your novel would never end. It would just go on for forever and ever talking about all these new characters, and your reader will get bored. And so you can't have every character be a primary character. You have to have flat characters. And everybody kind of understands that there are going to be these flat characters when they read, and they expect there to be flat characters. However, you should not have flat characters just for the sake of filling it up with bodies. Your flat characters have to have purpose. They have to be there for a reason. They have to be there to interact with your primary characters for specific reasons. But they are important because they are there for the primary characters to push off of, to use as a pressing point to continue through the plot, or to continue through some important part of their own personal story arc. And those are 7 characters that you should consider having in your novel, along with a little bit of definitions about some of the terms that I used, such as major and minor and protagonist and antagonist. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that it gives you some ideas of maybe some new characters or some new character methods to introduce into your work, and that can help your work flourish a little bit more. And I'd like to take this moment to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure you ring that little bell so that you get notifications when I put up new videos, which should be on a normal week every Tuesday and Friday. And then I update my blog over at Bethenaeum.com, which you can find the link to below, every Monday and Thursday. And you can find similar stuff to what you see in these videos if you are interested in wanting more. And as always, thank you for your time, and I appreciate you. Bye.